My job is to somehow make them curious enough or persuade them by hook or crook to get more aware of themselves and where they came from and what they are into and what is already there, and just to bring it out. This is what compels me to compel them, and I will do it by whatever means necessary.
Welcome to the Black Girls Heal podcast, where we talk about healing our intimacy disorders, unresolved trauma, and building a healthy relationship with first ourselves and then others. Every episode, we will talk about advice you can apply today to break unhealthy patterns and grow in your self-worth. I'm Shena, Love Addiction Coach and Trauma Specialist. Let's begin. Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Black Girls Heal. So we are at our last episode of our mother wound series, where there are different episodes or different topics where I'm talking about the different aspects of mother wounds. And so we've talked about coping with jealousy from a mother relationship, and we talked about mother hunger last week. And if I air this episode when I'm recording it, this week I am slated to talk about narcissistic relationships or relationships with narcissistic mothers, or women who present with narcissistic symptomology or qualities. And when I sat down to record it, I had a really amazing guest who was going to co-record with me. I started to think about, we've been talking about different themes around this for a while. And I wonder if it may be good to save that episode for the future, but maybe talk about something that isn't really talked about a lot when it comes to mother wounds and mother wound trauma. And that is sexual abuse that happens when you are abused by someone who is a woman. This is one of the really secret things that we don't really talk about when it comes to the different types of abuse. We'll talk about emotional abuse, we'll talk about maybe even physical abuse and mental abuse, but sexual abuse is something that isn't really acknowledged. And whether or not it's because of this belief that women can't really be predators, or if it happens from a woman, it's not as impactful or triggering or harmful, but it is. Also, that sexual abuse does not have to mean that there is contact, that it can include talking about sexual things. It can involve the energy that this person has when they're around you. Whatever it is that you as a little child, it feels overwhelming, it feels intense, and it creates a lot of pain. So I actually recorded the episode that y'all are going to listen to years ago, back when the podcast was still called Love Junkie, when I focus on sex and love addiction for all genders, persons of all backgrounds and everything. And I remember I pulled the episode because I was just concerned about whether or not when I transitioned to BGH, to Black Girls Heal, if this is a topic that fit in fully with what we were talking about here. But if we are looking at where our blocks with intimacy, with feeling safe, with showing up, those of us who may have difficulty with female relationships, talking about this type of trauma is really important. So, with that said, you've heard the content for today's episode. You hear what it's about. It is up to you to decide if you want to hear about this, to hear about what may be the impact and also next steps for you to take. There will not be any graphic scenarios in this episode. However, I did want to include this in our series as a resource for anyone who may need it, or at least for a lot of what I do here. What I try to do here is to put names to things that we just kind of maybe blow off or try to deal with ourselves or get over, especially because no one else is talking about it. And so if this is for one person who has gone through this and didn't quite know what to call it, or didn't quite know that they could call it something, I hope that you find this helpful. So that's it. Let's go ahead and jump on in. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Before we get started, let's take a small break to say thank you to this week's sponsors. So there's someone in your life that you know you need to let go of, but you're too afraid that once you will, he or she will magically change. You're fearful that they will find someone else and that you'll be stuck alone or that they'll be happier without you. And so you're frozen, not making a change, not knowing if you were doing the right thing or if you're wasting your time. I absolutely get it. It can be so hard to let go of or even just shift and adjust relationships that mean the world to you. Where do you balance keeping true to yourself while also making sure that the relationships you have are those that benefit you? In my signature program, The Recovery School, I help you overcome this fear that keeps you stuck so that you can actually move forward by either cutting ties or creating boundaries in this relationship. In this program, I combine group coaching, attachment and therapeutic support, and clear actionable plans to help you finally break these patterns and grow in your self-worth. Learn more and get started today at therecoveryschool.com. Again, that is therecoveryschool.com. Stop sacrificing your happiness and start speaking up for what you want and the love that you deserve today. So I have not done a good job advertising this before I insert this episode, but this mini series is part of a 4-part series, our winter workshop series, where the last month we talked about our relationship with ourselves and building a self romance. We had a workshop on that. And we are having a workshop for mother wound trauma and cutting ties with mother wound trauma this upcoming weekend on well, not this upcoming weekend, 2 weekends from now on Saturday, February 24th at 10 a.m. CST. So, if there are wounds around your relationship with your mother and wanting to learn how to work through them, that is going to be the workshop for you. We are going to go several hours into talking about these things, giving you next steps, talking about how to unwire the impact of all these things and move forward. So you can learn more about this workshop by going to blackgirlsheal.org/2024 and you can register and save your seat there. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump on in. You are going to hear from therapist Candice Christiansen, who is an expert in the realm of sexual trauma and how it is related to those of us who present with sex and love addiction. And she has a special focus for those of us who may have experience this with those who are women in our lives. And of course, there's going to be things that she shares here that may help those of us who maybe had those who are men be abusers as well. But I really hope that this episode helps validate your experience and helps you have some more information, have some more feelings to bring to your own therapist and to help you move forward. All right, that's it. Let's go ahead and jump on in.
All right. So today on the podcast, we have Candice Christiansen. Hey, Candice.
Hi, how are you?
I am fantastic. I have been wanting to talk about what we're going to discuss for a while, and I'm so happy that we connected so that we can dive into it, and hopefully it could be beneficial to others.
Yes, I think it actually will be. It's definitely a dicey topic that we're seeing more and more in the news.
For sure, for sure. Well, before we get started and I dig into what we will be discussing, can you tell everyone about yourself?
Yes, so my name is actually pronounced Candice Christiansen, and I am the founder of 2 programs. One is Namaste Center for Healing in Salt Lake City, Utah, and the other is the Prevention Project, which is a global prevention project. Namaste Center for Healing is an outpatient treatment center. We treat folks with various intimacy issues in infidelity, sex addiction, porn addiction, sexual anorexia, and trauma survivors, betrayed spouses. We do a lot of couples work and the like. A few years ago, my background is working with sex offenders as well as trauma survivors. I've been on both sides of the spectrum. And as I started my private practice before Namaste Center for Healing, I noticed that men were coming to my program and they were describing what they thought was sex addiction, but they were moving into more deviant realms, illegal and dangerous realms. And I thought to myself, these aren't convicted sex offenders. We know that that's a legal construct. And so we need a program for men and women who are engaging in dangerous behavior before they actually have a contact sex crime. And so that's where the Prevention Project came from. And now we are actually well known globally. We're in 51 countries. And we have a podcast that's gone viral where we treat individuals who have minor attractions, who do not want to offend, but we also treat individuals, men and women, who are legally involved based on various sex crimes. And so that's my background. I'm really passionate about sexual abuse prevention, and my focus is not just working with survivors, but also working with folks who are at risk for offending. And so I do quite a lot on a national and global scale for prevention. So it's a little bit about me.
A wonderful description of why I think you're perfect to talk about what we are sharing. So today's topic is about sexual abuse by women.
Yes.
And I wanted you on specifically because you do have so much experience for both sides, for helping survivors and those who have acted out in these ways. Today's podcast, though, is going to take more of the perspective of those who have been victims of sexual abuse. But I definitely am so happy you talked about the prevention project, because if there is anyone who is listening who can relate to having attractions to minors, to reach out to you, and we'll talk about your resources at the end of the podcast as well.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, so like I said, I wanted to talk about sexual abuse by women, because most of the time when we talk about sexual abuse and recovering from sexual abuse, it's either said or implied that it's by men. And we don't often mention women as perpetrators. And people I've seen and noticed that a lot of my clients are victims of sexual abuse by women, but there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of minimizing, there's a struggle to call it that because they're a woman. It's hard to, to say that out loud, I guess, in some way. And it's not the archetype of what a sexual abuser looks like. So I wanted to start out by asking you, what is your experience about how often people report sexual abuse by women?
Well, I will say this. I think we're starting to see it more. I know that of the clients that we work with, especially Namaste, we see men coming in as well as women who didn't report as a child, but similar to what you shared, they'll say, I was sexually abused by my mother, by a babysitter. And what's interesting is they actually don't call it sexual abuse. So they describe what clinically we would say is sexual abuse, but they don't necessarily describe it say the words, I was sexually abused. Rather, they'll say, this happened to me by a babysitter, for instance, a female babysitter, and they look at it more as a rite of passage, or, my mother was, wanted to bathe me until I was a 10-year-old, so on and so forth, or sleep with me and touch me in places without describing it. We hear that. We are seeing more, I will say, in the media about teachers to students, female teachers. So that I'm hearing more of in terms of reporting, but of the clients that we work with, they'll come to us as an adult and it never was reported. And I think you're right on when you say there really is a stereotype in the way that we view culturally females and males in terms of sex offenders. I think there's this belief that, we have these gender-based stereotypes that women are non-aggressive, they're very nurturing and so on and so forth. And therefore, the only way they could be involved in abuse or sexually abuse another person is if they're mentally impaired or if they're coerced. And in some cases that's true. There is more research coming out, though, that shows that some women do commit their first sex offense alone. While their recidivism rate is lower, they aren't always coerced or dependent on a co-offender, if you will. And so, long answer to that question, but it's pretty complicated because based on those stereotypes, a lot of people won't come forward until they're adults. And then we have to really unpack the layers and layers and layers of trauma and now adult relationship issues that men and women have because they were abused by a female.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely want to learn more about the different types of abuse that happen with women, to know if you could elaborate a little bit more. But before we get there, just to know a little bit about those who do offend. In your experience, is it something that's been passed down through the generations, or is there a different root cause?
So it's interesting because research indicates that if it's a parent to a child, so if it's a mother to a child, there's oftentimes they'll report having a history of their own abuse as a child. If it's more a teacher to student, while I've seen in my work with the females who've sexually offended against a student, for instance, I've seen just in my own work, women will say, well, I did have dysfunction in my upbringing. However, research does indicate that for teachers to students, they'll often say, well, no, not necessarily, didn't have a history of child abuse, but I do have a dysfunctional adult relationship and some attachment deficits. I think of one female offender when I was working with the Department of Corrections here in Utah, and she was in the correctional system. She had described being horrifically bullied during high school, and so became a teacher and went back into the exact same high school. And, that was her way to, quote, pay back. She had grown up and saw herself as this ugly duckling, as she called herself, and grew up as this very attractive woman. And so had that arrested development from when she was bullied and went back, and that was her way to, quote, pay back or get back. And so there are definitely some interesting, what the research shows versus sometimes what we see, I think, clinically in front of offenders is different per report. But we do know, if we look at more research is done on male offenders, and I would say this is could be likened to female offenders. And in my own work, I have some females on my caseload who have a history of sexually offending. They were sexually abused as children, did come from an incredibly dysfunctional family background, and then replicated that trauma. And so again, going back and looking at that is also essential in their own recovery.
It's really good to know. And hopefully for anyone who's listening who can relate, they're starting to put some pieces together and also starting to feel some validation, right? Because I would imagine that if I were an offender and I was trying to stop these behaviors or try to suppress what I was feeling, it might be crazy making, because, people don't talk about this, and we only talk about it in a way that maybe villainizes what people are going through. And so I appreciate you giving some answers to questions people might have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So going back to those who may be survivors of sexual abuse, what are some types of abuse that may go underreported or minimized because there is a woman who's the perpetrator?
So as I said, parent to child, mom to child is one that we hear a lot of. And when I think about the males, especially that we worked with at Namaste, who come in and describe being abused sexually, emotionally, and physically by mom, there is a lot of unpacking, if you will, to do, because a lot of times they'll develop an enmeshed relationship, and then there's a lot of shame. They feel like they've had to caretake their mother emotionally, sexually, and otherwise. And so that is a big one. Another one that I hear quite a bit is the babysitter scenario, where I'll be gathering, if I'm working with, say, an individual that comes in and they've got sex addiction, for instance, and they come in and we're doing a sexual history, we're gathering a sexual history, and they'll say, well, yeah, my first sexual experience was with a babysitter who, had me touch her breasts or so on and so forth. And so then we talk about, well, how old were you? How old was the teen? Because it's often a teen, if not an older female, and really start to explore that with the language of, that was not consensual. And for a lot of the men, they'll describe, I didn't think of it that way. I didn't look at it that way. But if we go forward in terms of, okay, well, let's look at boundaries now in the future and how that's replicated in terms of your struggle with boundaries, or especially with women, or feeling taken advantage of, or getting in relationships where non-sexually as much as sexually you find yourself kind of backing down or giving in, and it creates a warped sense of boundaries, that can stem from that. And we'll talk, I know that you and I had talked about discussing arousal templates, so we can definitely talk about that. One of the other things that we see, I don't hear a lot about this, but this is coming out more publicly, but forced prostitution with post-pubescent females, for instance. So the females coming into treatment because they were forced into prostitution. I can think of some cases where female victim, for instance, was forced into prostitution by her mother. And so, that's definitely something where the relationship gets incredibly skewed because it's the mother doing that in terms of forcing prostitution, whether it's through boyfriends or strangers. And, we already talked about the teacher to student, but a lot of folks will come in, males saying, I thought it was really hot that my teacher was attracted to me, and I found that, a rite of passage. And I've also had females, adults, come in and say, well, I had a male teacher who was inappropriate with me, or did this with me, and I was too ashamed to say anything, or this was my coach, a coach on my soccer team, for instance, female to male offender, or female coach to male, or female coach to female victim. And so, I was very nervous to say anything. And then lastly, this is more, we're talking about intimate partner violence, but female offender to a partner, for instance, in say a lesbian relationship where there's intimate partner violence and there's sexual abuse that goes along with that. I do work with, female survivors who are in a domestic violence situation that are in a lesbian relationship who have described being sexually abused. But don't want to report there, and they want to stay in that relationship and don't want to report. So there's quite a bit when we're talking about female abusers that definitely goes unnoticed. And of the male and female survivors that come into treatment, it's not necessarily, it is minimized, and not because the victim is consciously necessarily minimizing it, but rather there's a lot of shame and a feeling that they in some way are responsible. And I think when we talk about victims with male offenders, there is that as well. I do think there's an added element of shame and embarrassment and humiliation when it is a female abuser, because our society has created such incredible stereotypes around the male perpetrator, that's in the van down the street, and don't really realize that, there can be female perpetrators just as much as males. So that's why I think in the research there still isn't a whole lot on female offenders, and the numbers, it's like 1%. Of female sex offenders. I think it's low because there's so much shame and embarrassment about reporting. I am going to add one more thing. I know I'm talking a lot, but I think this is really key in looking at how our culture views female sex offenders. When I worked with corrections, and I have a lot of respect for law enforcement and corrections. I think they have an incredibly challenging job, both female corrections officers and males. I did hear from male corrections officers comments such as, when I worked with female sex offenders in one of the units, kind of these snide, sarcastic comments that, oh, she's too hot to be a sex offender, or females can't sexually offend. And these were the corrections officers that were overseeing these women in corrections facilities. And so I do want to say on your podcast, there definitely needs to be a change in the way that our entire system, corrections, therapists, law enforcement, culturally views women who do sexually offend, because they are out there.
For sure. Yeah, I think also for people to get training to work with offenders, because I think because there's a lack of knowledge and training and education, it fuels the bias, right?
I agree. I agree 100%. And there's not really a lot of oversight either with training, and every state is different. So I appreciate that you said that. Yeah,
for sure. To go back to some things that you said, though, that I had more questions about. So I definitely can empathize, and I relate to having client responses where there was a lot of, and I am going to use the word minimizing of what happened with them, especially in babysitter type scenarios or family friend scenarios, and that saying that what happened to them was more of maybe sexual play or the rite of passage that you said, or that it wasn't that big of a deal. But when we look at where a lot of these things started, it started with those experiences, and it started with not having that lack of consent about what happens with your body and what people force you to do or coerce you to do to their body as well. So my question is, what do you typically say to your clients, or what would you say to anyone who's listening who is like, yeah, that happened to me, but I mean, I hear what you're saying, but it didn't really affect me that much?
Well, I do my best to meet people where they're at in that regard, because if a client isn't ready, or an individual who's even listening today isn't ready to hear that, then they're going to continue to say, that didn't affect me as much. I think what I try to do is a lot of just educating, If an individual I'm working with has children of their own, and I will use that example, so, hey, how would you feel if your daughter or son came home and said, I need to let you know that my female teacher did this? Or they came home one day and, and the babysitter leaves, the female babysitter, and they said, Mom, Dad, I need to tell you that this happened with a babysitter. And so sometimes doing that, where it gets them out of themselves and they can see, especially if they have their own children, it helps them understand, okay, wow, that, absolutely would not be okay. I would label that as sexual abuse. I think another thing I do is I acknowledge that trauma survivors in general are incredibly resourceful and will compartmentalize and dissociate and do quite amazing things to cope and survive. And so one of the things I'll say is, okay, I get that this is where you're at right now. And, I'm just asking you to trust me in this process, that as we do trauma therapy, this may come up again, that if you don't have emotion around it, or you don't physically have a response, because our body always remembers trauma and holds it, that down the road, as we start, whether it's, EMDR trauma therapy, or some of the other trauma therapies, it may come up again where you do start to feel angry and you do start to want to work through this. I also will say, for those individuals, and we primarily work with individuals that are coming to us with intimacy disorders and intimacy issues and sexual issues and relationship issues and trauma that they hold in their body, I will point that out, that, every single person I've worked with that has any sort of intimacy issue, we can go back and there's some form of trauma in their history. Now, trauma is relative. I will say that trauma is relative to each person. Being neglected or a latchkey kid could be traumatizing to one person and not to another. So I'm not saying that every person that I worked with that has an intimacy disorder, for instance, sex addiction, has some form of sexual abuse. I will hold to saying though that every person I worked with that comes in with intimacy issues does have some sort of trauma in their past. And trauma, again, can be covert or overt. And so that's something that I'll educate my clients on as well. And for those that are listening, I would just be open to, you don't even have to call it trauma if you don't want to. Simply be open to looking at that in a different way. Because if you are struggling with relationship issues, intimacy, having any sort of sexual body issues, that could play a part in that, whether you're conscious of that or not. So just being open to that as one area to look at, it would be my encouragement.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I kind of want to move into the impacts, but before we do, the examples that you gave before talked a lot about, and you did talk about lesbian couples, but it talks a lot about female perpetrators to males. I'm wondering if when it's a female perpetrator to a female, if the impact is any different or if it's more significant in a way or just presents differently.
I will say, I think it presents a little bit differently because of the stereotypes and the shame. I do also want to add in that I have worked with male survivors of sexual trauma from a female in intimate partner relationships. So I definitely, for those male listeners who have been raped by their spouse, partner, girlfriend who's a, partner who's a female, I want you to know that I know that that's real because I think our society also downplays that and claims, oh, women couldn't possibly rape men or sexually assault men. The impact that I see that's a little bit different has to do with the stereotypes, that the belief that women couldn't possibly do that or do such a thing. However, when we look at the psychological impact, there are similarities. The PTSD, the anxiety, the depression, the distrust in relationships, the panic, the anxiety, the sleep disorders, the overeating, undereating, the deprivation issues, and perhaps even the acting out behaviors as replication of that trauma. And so in terms of those types of impacts, I do see similarities. In terms of the belief about how, quote, bad the impact was, I think that's where there's a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's also dangerous territory. So thank you for adding to that, because I don't want to compartmentalize or say one person's pain is worse than another, because that's definitely not the truth.
No.
I love a good story. Whether it's Issa Rae giving a modern yet hilarious depiction of what it looks like to be a young Black woman navigating love and relationships in America, or Toni Morrison beautifully weaving the most majestic stories of the Black experience of pain, growth, identity, culture. A good story is not only healing, but it connects us to those who are influencing our culture and moving it forward for the better. The next generation of influential Black voices can be found on NPR's new collection, Black Stories, Black Truths. Black Stories, Black Truths is a celebration of Blackness from NPR. Each of NPR's Black voices are as distinct, varied, and nuanced as the Black experience itself. In the Black Stories, Black Truths collection, you'll hear stories of joy, resilience, empowerment, and creating world-shifting things out of struggle. Every episode is a living account about what it means to be Black today, told from a unique Black perspective. From Bobby Shmurda to The Wire, Michelle Obama to reparations, there's no limit to the range of Black stories, Black truths. Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now they are the story. In NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, you'll find a collection of some of NPR's best podcast episodes celebrating the Black experience. Hear a feed of episodes from across NPR's podcasts that center Black voices. It's NPR Noir. Turn on NPR today and hear a range of voices as varied, nuanced, and Black as the country we reflect. Stories should never be about us, without us. Listen now to Black Stories, Black Truths from NPR, wherever you get your podcasts. When healing from an intimacy disorder, one of the first things you have to do right after getting clear on your patterns of addictive behaviors, avoidant behaviors, and living in deprivation is clearing out the roots that caused it. Clearing out the experiences, the traumas, the narratives that have kept you stuck all of these years. In my signature coaching program, The Recovery School, you have the opportunity to reveal the sources of low self worth, to learn about how old roles in your family have resulted in codependency, shutting down, and not letting others in. And also to learn how to talk to and connect to your inner child in a way that is soothing and healing. This is the next step to reframing the old stories that have plagued you for years to evolve to being a healed and loved woman and having access to the love and the relationships and self worth that you've always wanted. Learn more and get started by going to therecoveryschool.com. Again, that is therecoveryschool.com. Any other impacts of sexual abuse by a woman, and if it might be different than sexual abuse by a male?
Well, I think there definitely is. I see a lot of, with the folks that come into treatment, both male and female, trust issues, incredible trust issues with authority. And we'll even see it show up if we have a female therapist working with a trauma survivor of a female, where there'll be this incredible sense of trust and projection, a lot of anger. So we have to unpack that and work through that, just in creating a safe relationship with the female therapist, so that the male or female victim knows, hey, I'm a safe person and you can trust me in order to even do the work. When necessary, we'll have an individual work with our male therapist, but really working on those trust issues that show up in the therapy office that are impacting the relationship. And I also think there's I see this more with men, but I think there's definitely an underlying current with women once we start to peel the layers back. But a lot of anger, if there's been a female abuser in their past, especially, but also if they're currently in a relationship where they're with a woman who's very abusive, not just sexually, but in other ways. A lot of anger and control issues that show up outside of that relationship, say at work, for instance, road rage, for instance, that we have to work through and really get to, okay, what are you really angry about? What's underneath that anger? Where are you feeling really powerless and victimized? So really layers and layers and layers of trauma. I've also seen which is interesting when it shows up, some cases where there was sexual abuse or trauma by a female, and then there's replication in terms of infidelity, where we're working through one night stands, where it's, I don't want to get close because women hurt me. And so I'll just pay for sex or have one night stands, or I'll just use people to get my sexual needs met. For men and women, when we look again and go back and see the history of their own sexual trauma, we'll look at, well, you felt powerless and victimized in this relationship, and so feel powerful when you can do the quote catch release now with these one night stands, or where you pay for sex, or you're the one that feels in control. So the impact is tremendous, and it's very layered, very layered.
This is the first time that I've heard someone mention road rage as a trauma response, but it makes complete sense.
Yeah. We work with a lot of road ragers that have sexual abuse histories, and then also have out of control sexual behavior. So it is tied together. It's fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. So we mentioned the arousal template earlier, and so I know that's clinical speak. So I was wondering if you can define what that is, and then also how sexual abuse by a female might impact their arousal template.
Sure. So we know, if we look at John Money, his research on sexual arousal template, we know that the arousal template surprisingly actually begins to form between the ages of 5 and 8. And so from there, if, we're learning and seeing, just kind of, there's this gentle imprint, if you will, in the brain, the non-sexual can impact what we end up being sexually aroused to. If as a child, especially, there's trauma of any form, and I've seen non-sexual trauma become sexualized, and I'll talk about that, that often gets replicated as well. And so, for instance, when I've talked about male survivors that I'm thinking about who grew up with a mother that was, say, extremely emotionally abusive, and then would sexually abuse on top of that, or walk around the house half naked, invite the teenage boy to come, wash her back and be very sexually inappropriate. What I've seen in terms of that, oftentimes will get sexualized in an attempt to master that trauma. We see that. And it's fascinating. Robert Stoller talks about this in his book Perversion, and I've seen it and described in other ways, where there is this trauma for both men and women, and I see this with male abusers as well. But we're talking about females, where they'll grow up and then it's truly becomes sexualized. And so, for instance, if I think about the male who, was felt grossed out and violated, having to watch mom change or help mom bathe, grows up and has sexualized that, not just with his partners, but if he's got acting out behaviors, for instance, with the folks that we work with, say if the individual has sexual compulsion or sex addiction, where now, part of their arousal becomes, I'm going to have this relationship, or I'm going to go to a massage parlor where there's going to be this mutual touch, for instance, or wow, I was, this 5-year-old and my mom was older. And so now I'm attracted to, I'll meet up with escorts that are older. And that's part of my arousal template to, quote, get off. And non-sexually, we see this as well, of the women I've worked with that are escorts or prostitutes who are non-sexually bullied, for instance, by their mothers as children. So involuntarily exploited, for instance, as a child. And I see this again with when there's male abusers as well, but with the females that I think of who had mothers who were verbally, emotionally, physically, sexually abusive, and demeaning, that grow up to be escorts. A lot of times what we'll be able to look at is, okay, well, I felt involuntarily exploited as a child. And so now I get on stage, or I'm paid for this, and I'm the one that's voluntarily exploiting myself, and I'm in control, and you're going to pay me, and I'm the one that wins. And so when we start to look at that behavior and say, okay, that's very emotionally arousing to them. It's not necessarily sexually arousing it when I'm thinking about the females I worked with that end up becoming escorts or prostitutes or strippers, for instance, but it is definitely emotionally arousing to them, especially when there's that financial component, because they're the ones in control now. And so those are a couple examples that I've seen with folks. I did talk about the female sex offender who was bullied as a teenager and felt very ugly, and so went back into the school and then ended up perpetrating against a student. That would be another example of that replication of trauma, but also that arousal template that gets very skewed, where you're sexualizing your trauma in an attempt to master that trauma. And so treatment with a female offender would, as well as males, but treatment with a female offender we need to look at that, go back and look at, where did your own arousal template form to where you're doing that. Now with the victims who grow up and now have unhealthy coping skills, we would also need to go back and look at, okay, let's look at your victimization and let's work through that and clear that out in trauma therapy so that you can have these healthier relationships and you aren't seeking unhealthy means in which to cope based on your trauma.
So let me ask you a question. I'm going to combine the information given by a few of our guests. So I've had Stacey Sproul on the podcast to talk about pornography, and I have Kelly McDaniel coming on soon to talk about what she called mother hunger originally, but now it's in her book, Ready to Heal, that talks about the destructive relationships that we have with our mothers and how that the trauma can manifest into sex and love addiction. When I think about some things that are commonly asked in therapy, I remember I was talking with one therapist who was asking, when talking about porn addiction, if the person, a female, likes to look at lesbian porn. And not necessarily because they are a lesbian, they can identify as straight, but just wondering if that is something that they do because that's something that commonly persists or presents. And so hearing you talk, I'm wondering if that could be an example of an arousal template being formed if you have a mother who is intrusive or abusive or walks around naked, or and that becoming sexualized to be the type of pornography you look into, even if you identify as heterosexual.
Perhaps. And what I would also say with that, if we're looking at folks that end up, and I love Stacy and I absolutely respect Kelly. Her book is phenomenal. We use it with our female sex and love addicts. And so one of the things that I'll see with folks, if they do get into pornography or get addicted to pornography, when we go back into their history, if there's mother trauma or female trauma from a female perpetrator, and they are looking at certain types of porn, sometimes we'll see folks that look at BDSM porn. Now, all the more power to people if they want to look at BDSM and there's no quote addiction in both, if they and their partner are into it and they're consenting. I'm not judging that. I do see folks, I think of this female who would enjoy looking at BDSM porn where, she would imagine herself being the female doing being the one that was in the dominant position. Now, again, I'm not going to get into the dominant sub, so on and so forth, because I understand that the sub oftentimes controls the room. But for her, it was very empowering for her to imagine being that person, quote, doing the acts, also like humiliation porn, where she was doing the humiliating because she was on the receiving end by a female perpetrator. And so, we do see that at times. I love that you bring up that folks that are heterosexual can often look at same-sex porn, gay, lesbian porn. We see that all the time. And so I will say too, one of the things that I've seen, which I think is really fascinating, is even if there is female or male abuser, it can actually show up with the opposite sex in terms of someone's acting out, or same sex in terms of acting out. So I do appreciate that you're bringing that up. The porn that people view of the porn addicts that we work with, absolutely, if we go back in their childhood and look at what happened to them non-sexually and sexually, and especially those that get into porn as a coping skill and end up having porn addiction, we find that there is a relationship there, whether they feel powerless and so the porn that they look at helps them feel empowered, or they are also the one that's, quote, more in the victim position in the porn they're viewing as a replication of the trauma. Let me give an example about rape porn, for instance. I have some clients that I work with, males who were sexually abused as children by females, who end up looking at pornography as teenagers and adults, and find themselves imagining being, when they look at rape porn, for instance, being the rapist. Now, these are individuals that are mortified and embarrassed and humiliated at acknowledging that in session, because they'll say, I would never even fathom raping a woman. But when we start to unpack their own trauma and go back and look, whether it was a mother or a teacher or some female in their life that was in a position of authority, and they felt so powerless and so out of control, sometimes they will end up looking at that. And so without judgment, we simply explore, what is that about? What, in terms of their arousal template, forming to that level, And then once they're able to look at and connect the dots, many times they'll say, that disgusts me now, when we can connect the dots for them and do some clearing out of that trauma. So yeah, your arousal template, especially with porn for males and females, when there's a male abuser and also female, can be impacted in that way.
Thank you. Oh, this has been so good, Candice.
Oh, I'm so glad.
So with that, I think this is a great time to start to talk about resources for people. And again, because you have in all of your projects and practice have experience for both sides, I would love to hear resources for those who are victims of female perpetrators and those who may be offenders or have desires to offend.
Okay. Yeah, so there's so many resources out there. I'm one, and we're in Utah, but we also have folks fly to us from all over the country. We do intensives, we do individualized programming. We have an outpatient program for sexual recovery and trauma recovery. So that's at Namaste Center for Healing. I always tell people my website, namasteadvice.com. Or our office number is 801-272-3500. And then the preventionproject.org. We specialize in treating minor attracted persons, both male and female, men and women who are attracted to minors, who do not want to harm but are scared. We work with young men 18 to 75 and women who have attractions that need help. We have a global program people can call in that we provide support for. Literally have people calling in all over the world for that support. The preventionpodcast.com if you're a minor attracted person and you want to hear from anti-contact pedophiles who are men and women talking on our podcast about their goal to never offend and where their attraction stemmed from, which interestingly enough, many have trauma in their past that gets replicated. We also have a legally involved program for folks who commit non-contact sex crimes such as view child pornography, online solicitation of minors. We have a global program for those individuals that can call in for support. We have folks fly in for intensives. And then folks that are private in the community who have not been arrested but are scared of their dangerous behavior, we do have a prevention group for them. We offer that globally. They can call into our group to get support. Our goal is truly prevention, teaching tools so that men and women do not cross over into a contact offense. Finally, I'm going to say this. We are globally known, and one of the things that I do a ton of global advocacy for is we treat individuals on the autism spectrum who end up in trouble legally for viewing child pornography or committing an online sex crime. So I'm globally known for that. And we do, I also do evaluations for those individuals in the criminal justice system, as well as individuals who have brain diseases who have ended up in the legal system because they've committed a crime, a sex crime. And so I'm really passionate about getting accurate treatment for folks on the autism spectrum and those with brain diseases who need accurate treatment that end up in the criminal justice system. So that is us, the preventionproject.org and namasteadvice.com if folks are interested.
Great. And something that I really pride myself with in Love Junkie is making sure that people can leave the episode today with something to do, either in the interim before they find a therapist or in addition to. So for someone who is a survivor of abuse and they're listening and really relating to a lot of these things, what are some actions or steps that you would suggest or books that they could get into to kind of start to deal with this trauma response to manage their triggers?
Well, I will plug my workbook. That's a great time. Mastering the Trauma Wound is my workbook. It's on Amazon. And I will say this, if you email me, and perhaps folks can reach out to you to get my email information, I'm happy to actually give you my workbook for free. So if you email me, I will send you a copy of my workbook. It's teaching folks mindfulness-based tools that are evidence-based, really simple tools to help support you in your healing from trauma so that you can have a healthier relationship. And then I'll also be creating a 12-week webinar based on my workbook in the fall. So yeah, folks can reach out to you, and then that you can send them to me, and I'm happy to send them my workbook for free.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I want a copy too, so I'll be emailing you.
Yeah, you email me. I will send you one. For sure.
Awesome. Great. Well, is there anything else you would like to share that we didn't get to?
I think that's it. I just appreciate being on the show so much.
For sure. So I have your website. Do you have any social media that I can share with people as well?
Oh my gosh, we are on everything. At Prevention Intervention is our Twitter handle. At Namaste Advice is our Twitter handle for Namaste. People can find us on Facebook as well. Just type in our names, Namaste Center for Healing or the Prevention Project, to reach us there as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Candice, so much for all of your wisdom and knowledge. I really appreciate it.
Of course. You're so welcome. My pleasure.